Welcome to Apex. My name's Jacob, and this video is all about salt. So if you're on an all-meat carnivore diet and you're unsure on what kind of salt you should be consuming or how much salt to consume, this video is for you. And as a matter of fact, if you're curious about salt in general, it doesn't matter what kind of diet you're on, this video is for you because I'm going to dive into everything about salt. And I'm also going to talk about a recent study that was done that tested 23 popular salt brands that found heavy metals in every single one. So without further ado, let's dive right in. All right, so I feel like a salt salesman right now because I have obviously a lot of salt behind me, but that's not what this video is about. I'm not trying to sell you salt, all right? I just happen to love salt. And me personally, based off my experience and the research I've done, I've learned that salt is a very fundamental nutrient and it is absolutely essential for proper human health. The only caveat to this is that I would say that the kind of salt matters. You can't just run out and consume table salt and expect to be all fine and dandy. You have to consume the right kind of salt. Now, over the years, I've been carnivore for 6 years now. I've found that for me on a carnivore diet, salt is very, very important because if I don't consume enough salt, I get horrendous muscle cramps, specifically in my calves, when I'm trying to sleep, which is an absolutely horrible experience. And salt also helps to regulate everything about my body. It makes me feel fantastic, gives me energy. It helps me retain water. It helps me retain minerals. And it also helps to regulate my heartbeat, which is, before coming to carnivore, I had a very severe heart arrhythmia. I had supraventricular tachycardia, which if it would have progressed, would have ended up being life-threatening. Essentially it was because it got really, really bad. And I did some videos about that. But I found that consuming salt along with magnesium and stuff like that helps to regulate that and helps to keep everything basically streamlined. So salt is very important. And we see that throughout nature. Animals will travel for miles and miles and miles to seek out salt. And as a matter of fact, this big bucket right here in the middle, that is salt for deer. And I put that out for my deer. And they seek it out. They'll actually mop the area out to get to that salt. Animals have to have it. It's very important, not just for us, but for everything in nature. In fact, it's so important that if we don't have enough of it in our blood at all times, we cease to exist. It will literally kill us. So that's how important it is. But the reason I have so much salt laid out here is because over the 6 years I've been carnivore, I've tried a lot of different salts. And I found some that I don't really like too much, and I found some that make me feel absolutely fantastic and I love the taste of. And a lot of them are right here behind me. My favorite of all time out of all the salts is Himalayan pink salt. As you can see, I have San Francisco, pure Himalayan, Himalayan Chef, Nature's Promise. I got a lot of pink Himalayan salts here. As a matter of fact, the deer, that's what that is, pink Himalayan salt. So that's my all-time favorite. Why? Because it contains 86 trace minerals on top of the salt. And that's what's very important about salt is that you want salt that contains all the minerals. You don't want the refined strip salt like Morton's that has iodine that's actually like put back in there because everything's stripped out of it. That's just literally sodium. And when you consume that kind of salt, I've noticed some people get edema from that. They get water retention. It makes them feel not very optimal. It can actually raise your blood pressure and things like that. But when you're consuming salt with all the minerals intact, that's the way nature intended it. That's how we've been doing it for thousands of years. We fought wars over that kind of salt. That's the kind of salt you want to consume. So pink Himalayan salt's my favorite. I've got canning salt back here. I've got sea salt. This is actually salt from Hawaii. I got this when I was out there. It's straight from the volcanoes, all right? The volcanoes of Mordor, that's some good stuff. This huge rock right here, I got this from Austria, straight out of the salt mine. This cost me 8.9 euro. I packed this in my pack. I've got several of these and brought it back with me. And you can't find this here very cheap, but I can tell you right now, the reason I bought this is because the best steak I ever had in my entire life was cooked on one of these rocks. Actually, 2 steaks. I had one in Mexico one time, and another in like Idaho, I think it was. But what you do with this is you heat this up over 1,000 degrees. All right, so you have to have a really, really hot oven. And then you sear a steak on this thing. And you eat the steak straight off the rock. And I'm telling you right now, if you've never had that, especially one of these that's seasoned, it is freaking phenomenal. Highly recommend that. All right, I have San Francisco Salt Company. I'm going to talk about a few of these here in a second. And I've got Redmond Real Salt. My favorite out of all these, honestly, is this Himalayan Chef. I think it has a fantastic flavor, and it's just my favorite out of all the ones I've tried. But I mean, I've got everything here. I've got black stuff, straight from the volcanoes, got real fine, real coarse, grinders. There's so many salts to choose from. So when it comes to choosing your salt, there's really no wrong answer. I mean, there's really not. It's all a matter of just finding a salt that suits you the best, that you enjoy, and one that makes you feel optimal. And to make this super easy for you so that you can quickly make a determination on what salt is best for you, I created the ultimate salt guide that has all the information in this video consolidated into one document. I'm going to put that in the description and pin it in the top comment. So be sure to go down there and download your free copy of that. All right, so let's talk about this study. Like I mentioned, they tested 23 brands and they did find heavy metals in every single one. The heavy metals they tested for was arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury, and aluminum. Now, they did not find mercury in any of the salts, which is fantastic because mercury is a very common one that people are exposed to, and it can be very problematic, so that's great. But they found traces of every single other one in every single one of the salts. Now, they also tested for microplastics. I'm not going to talk about that in this video because the amounts they found was very minute, and it didn't even register, so we'll pretty much assume that the amount of microplastics in these salts is pretty safe. But for the other heavy metals, aluminum they found in 78% of the salts tested. Arsenic was found in 100% of the salts tested. Cadmium was found in 70% of the salts tested. And lead was found in 96% of the salts tested. And like I mentioned before, all this information is going to be in the salt guide, so be sure to download your copy of that so you can see exactly what was in each one of these salts. And some of the salts that they tested are sitting right here behind me. Redmond Real Salt is actually one of those. And, you know, Redmond is one of my favorites. I've been consuming Redmond for many, many years. And Redmond actually has some of the highest levels out of all the ones they tested. So that's not a good thing. But let's talk about why this is happening. And this is very, very important because I don't want this video to be fear-mongering. I don't want it to scare you. Because it's important to keep in mind that anything that comes from the earth and the sea is going to have some levels of heavy metals in there. Why is that? Because heavy metals occur in nature. These are natural elements that are found in our environment. That's why we're exposed to them every single day. That's why we can tolerate them in certain amounts. And when you mine stuff from the earth and you get things like salt, there's going to be heavy metals in there unless it's highly refined. But again, you don't really want to consume highly refined salt because that takes us away from what is natural. But keeping that in mind, just understand that you're not going to get away from this stuff. You're not going to get away from heavy metals. It's probably a good thing to pick one that is not super high in heavy metals, just so that you can mitigate your risk of exposure or potentially developing heavy metal toxicity. But in my personal opinion, and this is just based off my own experience because I've dealt with heavy metal toxicity before, is that if your diet and your lifestyle is pretty much heavy metal free, or you've done things that really mitigate your risk of exposure to heavy metals in general, then the heavy metals coming from salts probably aren't going to be that problematic in the grand scheme of things. But if you're consuming a standard American diet and you're consuming tons of grains, which are completely high in heavy metals, or you're consuming plant products or all these other processed foods that are very high in heavy metals, and you're consuming salt, that could be problematic. Because the important thing to keep in mind is that the FDA has set heavy metal thresholds based on daily exposure. So that is daily exposure from everything. All right, so that's the problem with heavy metals, is they're bioaccumulative and they build up in your body over time through repeated exposure. And heavy metal toxicity is a very, very big problem because it can lead to a vast array of negative health outcomes. In general, heavy metals are neurotoxins. They can cause mood disorders, behavioral disorders. They can impair cognitive function. Things like aluminum have been linked to Alzheimer's. They can lead to hormone disruption, metabolic dysfunction. Most of them are endocrine disruptors. They can cause cellular damage. They can really, really destroy your health. So heavy metals is not something you want to play around with, and you want to mitigate your exposure as much as possible. So if you have a single salt brand that is exposing you to the upper limit of the heavy metals that you're potentially safe to consume, but you're also consuming other things that are also very high and near that threshold of heavy metals, these are bioaccumulative. They're going to build up in your body over time, And the chance of you developing heavy metal toxicity from repeated exposure and from multiple exposures in your environment and in your diet, then the chance of you developing heavy metal toxicity is going to be much higher than somebody that's eating like a carnivore diet, which is super low in heavy metals and only consuming salt, which would be the main source of heavy metals. And there's a couple other reasons why salts have heavy metals in there. Another big reason is from pesticides. I've mentioned this numerous times on this channel before, and I will continue to mention it because I think it's very, very important and is often overlooked. But modern day pesticides are full of heavy metals. They actually add them in there intentionally. Okay, and the heavy metals, not only do they go into the plants and the grains and all the foods that we consume, but they go into the soil. And when they go into the soil, they can make their way into the sea. So they come out in sea salt, or they can make their way into the salt reserves, the salt mines, or, just salt in the ground. And then when that's mined from the earth, it can be in the salt. Another big reason is just simple contamination, through the processing and stuff like that of the salt. These machines and the things they use to process salts can put heavy metals in there. Storage is another one, and that kind of ties into the processing. Again, it's just the things that the salts come in contact with could transfer heavy metals into the salts. Food additives is another big one, but that only applies to the salts that have other things added in there. Like when we start talking about all these refined salts and table salts and stuff like that, a lot of times they have flow agents and other additives, and those additives can sometimes contain things like aluminum. As a matter of fact, aluminum specifically is the most common one that they put in like baking products and salt products and stuff like that. And another big way that heavy metals find their way into our salt is from air pollution. And this can come from numerous different things. It can come from manufacturing, just the industrial complex in general, all these factories and stuff like that put off pollution into the air. It finds its way into the water cycle. It can come from emissions from our cars, and it can even come from chemtrails. All right. And a lot of people will say that's conspiracy. And I used to think the same thing back in the day, but they've basically come out now and they've admitted to the fact that they're doing geoengineering and they're spraying aluminum-based compounds with other heavy metals and stuff in there into the atmosphere to create clouds. It's cloud seeding. And that goes into the water cycle because they're creating clouds with these heavy metals, and it rains back down on us, and it's poisoning us, it's poisoning our food system, and it's poisoning our salt. It's poisoning the planet. So when it comes to choosing the right kind of salt, there's really no right or wrong answer here. It's just a matter of picking one that works best for you, that makes you feel optimal, one that you think tastes good, one that you enjoy. And if you want to avoid heavy metals or you want to mitigate your exposure, just pick one that's lower in heavy metals. And again, the salt guide is going to have all this information in there so that you can go there as a quick reference. You can find the ones that have the lowest amounts and pick one that you're comfortable with. So with that said, how much salt should we be consuming? This is where it gets really, really easy. And this is very individualized. The amount of salt you should consume is totally up to you. If you're eating the right kind of salt, if you're eating something that has all the minerals intact, something that comes from the earth, from the sea, something that is non-refined and that is natural, you can consume as much salt as you want as long as it makes you feel good. So for some people, especially if you're on a carnivore diet, that might mean consuming a lot more salt than what you're used to. For me personally, for the first 2 or 3 years I was carnivore, I consumed a complete shaker full of salt every single week. That's a lot of salt. That's a lot more salt than I've ever consumed in my entire life, but it made me feel absolutely fantastic. Now that I'm a little bit further on in my carnivore journey, I've found that I don't require as much salt, so I consume probably about 1/4 to 1/2 a shaker a week, somewhere around there. But there are some people that don't do well with salt at all. Matter of fact, there's some people that don't salt their food, period. And it really comes down to the person. So if you're consuming salt and you don't feel very optimal, you might want to scale that way back. Just because a lot of people say that you're supposed to consume a lot of salt on a carnivore diet doesn't necessarily mean that's true for you. We all have to kind of blaze our own path when it comes to this and figure out what works best for us. And really what that boils down to is trusting your gut, trusting your intuition, listening to your body, hearing what it's telling you, and making proper adjustments to optimize your health. That's what it's all about. And one thing I'll say about this is I've seen people have certain skin conditions and other ailments that you wouldn't really associate with salt. I've seen people have that. And now that this study's come out and I've really thought about the connection between salt and heavy metals, I wonder if these people had higher levels of heavy metals in their body already, and maybe they were consuming a brand of salt that has very high levels of heavy metals also. And maybe that's just wreaking havoc on their health, making them feel like garbage, causing skin conditions, and leading to other problems, because heavy metal toxicity can lead to a lot of really bad things, and it can be really hard to pinpoint. So if you're consuming a lot of salt and you're running into problems, maybe it's not the amount of salt you're consuming, but the type of salt. So keep that in mind. And on the flip side of that, if you're getting heart palpitations, muscle twitches, muscle cramps, if you feel lethargic and just don't have energy, or you just don't feel great overall, and you're not consuming a lot of salt, consider adding salt in there. Because for a lot of people, especially people on low carb or zero carb diets, they often require a lot more salt because you're not consuming carbohydrates, so your body has a harder time retaining water and retaining minerals. So by adding salt in there, it can really help your body retain minerals and retain water. And that in turn is not only going to make you feel better, but it's also going to optimize your health overall. So hopefully you got some value out of this. Be sure to go down and download your free copy of the Ultimate Salt Guide so you can make an informed decision on what salt is best for you. And if you think you might be suffering from heavy metal toxicity, or you've been consuming a brand of salt that is very high in heavy metals, be sure to watch this video right here, which is going to help you mitigate your risk of exposure and show you how to detox from them. So be sure to leave a comment down below. Let me know if you get some value out of this. And as a matter of fact, share your favorite brand of salt down below, because as you can see, I'm always up for trying something new.